Oh, hey guys, this is Speckernet Ryan DeBar. This is going to be a video about Clarksburg, West Virginia, and the politics in Clarksburg. I don't really enjoy talking about it as much as maybe you think I used to enjoy it because I don't live there anymore. The city manager recently proposed making it illegal to subdivide houses within the city limits. Because that proposal sounds something very similar to something I put forward years ago, I feel like I kind of need to speak to this matter. I want to make sure that everyone understands it was never my intention to demonize poor people or push them out of their housing. What I wanted was a controlled, deliberate process to get them housing in better places where they could get to work, get groceries easier, be safe getting to and from their house. About 10 or 12 years ago, I looked at a zoning map of the city and realized most of the crime and drug problems existed in places that allowed apartments. I could go on and talk for 20 minutes about the relationship of density and crime, but that's really beside the point. What I said back in beginning 2015 is that the city should stop allowing further subdivision of homes in these neighborhoods. However, I also proposed that more areas of the city be opened up to apartments, especially if they were near main streets where buses run or near amenities such as grocery stores. I also wanted Centra to start running more hours so that people who were poor and didn't have a car but worked night shift or evening shift could get to and from work. There's an issue with prowlers roaming all around residential neighborhoods. I think all of us who owned a home in Clarksburg at some point have had to confront somebody or call the police on somebody who was obviously sizing up the neighborhood to see what they could steal. I've physically confronted people doing that. I've called cops. And the problem is that there's a lot of people who have a reason to be walking up and down the street, and they're poor, and you can't tell them apart from these prowlers. If you just had less reason for these poor people to walk down the street, there'd be a lot less suspicion and a lot less cover for the ones who are up to no good. But really, the bigger problem is that when you put people who don't own cars way back in the far reaches of neighborhood, it's dangerous for them. A terrible example of this is a case, I think back in 2015, where there was a young couple recently out of high school. They were pushing their baby carriage on their way back to Laurel Lane's apartments on a street that did not have a sidewalk, and someone came up over the hill, hit them, and killed the baby. You know, we are housing people in places that don't have sidewalks to them. Oak Mountain Apartments is another. It has sidewalks all the way down the US 19, but from the Hardys there, or at least from St. Mark's Lutheran, all the way to former United Hospital Center, there's no sidewalks on US 19. There's not even a shoulder. People have to walk in the street, and I've come up on an old man in a mobility scooter in an ice storm. No, it was terrifying to me. It's wrong. It's wrong to put people in these places and these positions. However, I came to regret the idea of downzoning because it's clear to me that a lot of people in leadership just want the poor to go away. Their mouth says they care, but their actions say otherwise. And one of the giveaways is they only want to address half the problem, which is the subdivided apartments, but they don't want to talk about how these people are going to get to work. And they don't want to talk about that kind of stuff. That's for a later time, and that time never comes. But another thing is, the city manager made an absurd claim. He said there's people living in homes that are subdivided 4 apartments, and they each have 3 cars apiece. So there's a house with 12 cars taking up every space along a street, and fire trucks can't get through. Blah blah blah. People who live across the street don't get to park. And that's not right, she says. It's also not real. That doesn't happen. The Census Bureau says that there's 700 people in Clarksburg who walk to work. It's almost 600, 577. And there's another 700 who hitch rides. It's 1,300 people who don't own cars that live in Clarksburg. And then there's hundreds more who don't work and aren't covered by these statistics because they're old or because they're disabled. These are the people that are living in these apartments. I'm not saying that there's no apartments taking up a little bit of street parking. But the issue is, as Martin Howe and others said, the city was built at a time when families owned one car and now families own three. That's what's taking up the space. That's city managers blew right past that and continued saying absurd stuff. She says, yeah, people have a right to a place to live, but what about the right of the homeowners that would like to park in front of their own house? Nobody owns the street in front of their own house. Nobody has a right to park in front of their own house. And in any case, the zoning code already requires each housing unit in the city have one off-street parking space. Now, houses that are built before 1960 are exempt from this requirement. However, if you build a new house or if you subdivide an existing house, that takes away the exemption. If there are apartments back in neighborhoods that have no parking spaces, it means the code enforcement office hasn't kept up with its job. And we know that already. We know that. So her proposal is to downzone large parts of the city. Downzoning in this case would mean that they're going to take away the right of a property owner. And property owners do have a right in these neighborhoods to subdivide their house. That's a constitutional right. Not only subdivide, it would take away the right of someone to rent their basement out to their nephew or niece. It would take away the right to rent out your garage apartment. And anytime you take away these kind of property rights, you're getting into trouble with Fifth Amendment constitutional rights. You can take away rights legally, but there's a process for it, and it can only be done for the public good, for the good of the whole people, and only after a fair hearing. This is called eminent domain. Now, downzoning does not allow the government to condemn apartments that already exist. You can't just say, well, I know there's an apartment tower here, but we want this to be single-family homes, so that tower has to come down. If the government wants to do that, they have to pay the landowner money. But they can say no new apartments are getting built. And there's ways the city can shut down existing apartments. For example, if there's fire safety violations, or if the house was converted to apartments without ever a proper building code permit being filed. The biggest problem with downzoning is that even I didn't understand this back in 2015, and I'm still coming to terms with it now. And just how many people in Clarksburg actually live in these subdivided houses. Now, the city's recently discovered that there's 1,400 properties on the tax rolls, on the property tax rolls at the county clerk's office or assessor's office that are listed as rental properties. But the city rental registry only has 840 units. The problem's even worse than that because they're counting properties, not subdivided apartment, each apartment. The Census Bureau says there's 2,500 apartments in the city of Clarksburg being rented right now, or as of April 2025. 2,500. And it's very common for more than one person to live in an apartment. So those 2,500 apartments might be 5,000 people. That's 1/3 of the city. And it'd be really hard to argue that making 1/3 of the city homeless, or kicking 1/3 of the people in a town out of their house is for the public good. It'd be real hard to argue that in front of a court and win. But it's not going to happen. They're not going to kick 5,000 people out of their houses because if the city can't keep up with the 800 inspections a year that it already knows it has to do, or 800 inspections every 2 years, it's not going to be able to keep up with 1,400, let alone 2,500. So what's going to happen is you're just going to broaden the pool of people that the city can selectively target. They'll target people they don't like. They'll target people that they know will pay up and have money, but they're going to ignore the people they do like and ignore the people that they know they're not going to get money from. That's what happens today, and it'll only get worse. I'm not suggesting that the city continue to ignore the problem of dangerous housing. I'm not saying that. I'm saying they need to work on allowing, promoting, creating more apartments in places with good access to shopping, mass transit, other amenities. Excuse me. They should work with Centra to extend service hours so the people who work in the evening and nights can get out to East Point, could get out to White Oaks to their jobs. And then and only then, after they start tackling these programs or problems, should they focus on eliminating existing housing. These proposals that they come up with every so often are just doubling down on things that have already been tried and have already failed. Kathy Goings introduced the rental registry 12 years ago, and now we're told it's not working. Jim Hunt dreamed up this demo program, catastrophically failed demo program 30 years ago. All the problems still exist, and they're worse than ever. Every election season out there's politicians who promise to remove poor people from their street. If you vote for me, I'll see that house down the street that looks ugly to you gets demolished. It gets people elected, but it doesn't solve any problems. Because the people who are willing to promise you little personal side favors that may or may not even be legal aren't the ones who are up to the task of fixing the really big problems that the city has. Those are two different kinds of people. Now y'all are paying the price for electing people who don't have any good ideas of their own. And I'm glad you're starting to realize that. The people who promise you easy fixes aren't the people who can plan fixing your water, sewer, and streets. Have a good weekend. I'll holler at you later.